You're listening to Poetry, Gossip, and the Pursuit of Pleasure podcast with Dale Byron. That's me. This is the place where we use and discuss poetry in very practical ways as we hitch it up to the challenges, the delights, the difficulties, and the joys in our lives. And this week's episode, which you've probably already seen, is entitled Everyone's Heart is Broken, Including You. And I know that's a little provocative. I meant it to be that way. And I want to try to make my case with the conversation I want to bring to you today and the poems and what we're going to do around those poems. My note says that this might be the first, in other words, this realization, this might be the first most important realization we can come to in these times, that being that our heart is broken, each of us, all of us. And not just in these times, but maybe particularly in these times, politically, socially, ecologically. But why is this important? Why is it important for us to own our sorrow and even to help others own theirs? Um, and also to help each other lighten the load of those sorrows, to help each other carry our sorrows. Why is that important? Well, because, while we can live without happiness for periods of time, and we do that, of course, it's difficult to live without any amazement or without any joy, to put it that way. And we essentially become frozen and stuck in our sadness, is my thesis today, and the sadness that we try to deny or run from. Have you noticed? And whether it's political, social, and ecological, any of those predicaments, and we're facing predicaments, and those are not just problems. Predicaments are the kinds of challenges that are incredibly complex, where there's not some single solution. There are a number of things that we can do to move through the predicaments, but they are complex. And so those political, social, and ecological predicaments that we really are facing in a bigger way in these days, they're going to get worse and worse and overwhelm us with us without our having the energy that we're going to need to get on the field of action and play. And I'm using that word play in a very broad sense. But that's what happens. My supposition is in today's episode, if we try to deny our sadness and the sadness of others and don't work directly with it. And my note says perhaps there's no one has said it better than poet and writer Ross Gay. And I've got to just give a shout out to Ross Gay right now. We saw him do a speech at a local bookstore recently here in the Bay Area, and he was just marvelous. And he was talking about his new book, which is Inciting Joy, which is this very subject. It's what inspired me to do this episode today. This idea that if we can acknowledge our own sadness and fully acknowledge it, and then if we are able to acknowledge others' sadness and actually help others carry their sadness, and they help us carry our sadness, then that opens up the world for a kind of very resilient joy. That's the supposition. And Ross Gay said it like this. He said, "Joy is what emanates from us as we help each other carry our sorrows. Joy understands that no one is without sorrow. No one is without sorrow." So you're seeing the reason for my title. Everyone is heartbroken, including you. And I could have said, and me, of course. That's implied. Everyone is heartbroken, which is also to say that everyone has the capacity for joy. Now, I just want to say again that this episode today is in Ross Gay's honor, because I think this is such a juicy juicy subject, and one that is so important, particularly important throughout history, of course, but particularly important now with what we're facing. Okay, let's dig right into the first poem we're going to cover today. It's by Ellen Bass, an amazing, amazing poet. Look her stuff up, buy her books. She's wonderful. This poem is called If You Knew, If You Knew, and kind of keep in the back of your mind, this theme that we're working on in today's episode. Okay, if you knew, this theme of each of us, our hearts are all broken. What if you knew, starts the poem, what if you knew you'd be the last to touch someone? If you were taking tickets, for example, at the theater, tearing them, giving back the ragged stubs, you might take care to touch that palm, brush your fingertips along the lifeline's crease. When a man pulls his wheeled suitcase too slowly through the airport, when the car in front of me doesn't signal, when the clerk at the pharmacy won't say thank you, I don't remember they're going to die. A friend told me she'd been with her aunt. They just had lunch, and the waiter, a young gay man with plum black eyes, joked as he served the coffee, kissed her aunt's powdered cheek when they left. Then they walked half a block, and her aunt dropped dead on the sidewalk. How close does the dragon spume have to come? How wide does the crack in heaven have to split? What would people look like? What would people look like if we could see them as they are? Soaked in honey, stung and swollen, reckless, pinned against time. Those last lines. What would people look like? What would they look like if we could see them as they are? Now, I might stop here and say, hearts all broken. And of course, with these images, Ellen Bass is showing us that, is having us feel how our hearts are broken and their hearts are broken. What would people look like if we could see them as they are, soaked in honey, stung and swollen, reckless, pinned against time? Someone in the audience, when we heard Ross Gay speak, I mentioned a week or so ago, asked him about his own sorrow. And one of the comments he made was, well, everyone I know and everything I love is going to go away. And so that was a pretty interesting answer. The other note I made for myself with this poem is, I love this. When a man pulls his wheeled suitcase too slowly through the airport, or when the car in front doesn't signal. Now, how many times do we get irritated, upset, and, just put adrenaline in our system when that happens? And yet, if we could remember that our heart is broken, their heart is broken, we are going to die, all of us. In fact, the note I made, to understand that we are all in the very same situation, walking around, not knowing when our own time has come, and knowing that everyone and everything we love is in this same boat. In this same boat. If we knew that, if we could actually work with ourselves and others in this way of realizing that there's a deep sadness that, again, our theme today, that if we can accept that sadness if we can, and I think poems help us do that. They give us language for this, that then, and help us recognize our own sadness, help others with theirs. That if we can do that, then we open ourselves up for a very resilient kind of joy. One of my friends I mentioned in last week's podcast, Brother David Stindl-Rast, he says, I'm interested in the kind of happiness that doesn't always depend on just what happens. That's a fierce happiness, I think. Okay, so let's keep on cooking. Now, this is the poet Julia Fehrenbacher, and not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right. I don't know much about her work, but I fell in love with this poem when I read it not too long ago. I thought it fit today's theme. She says it like this: Go gently today. Go. Oh, I'm sorry. The title of the poem is called "The Cure for It All." The Cure for It All. In case you want to look it up. Go gently today, says Julia in the first line. Go gently today. Don't hurry or think about the next thing. How hard is that to do? I'm out on the hiking trail. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. And yet I'm sitting there thinking about, well, am I going to have a coffee in a little while, or what am I going to do? Like Ram Dass said, be here now. Although in a fit of humor, he also said, if you can't be here now, come back later. So we get a chance over and over again to be here now. She says it like this. Back to the poem. Go gently today. Don't hurry or think about the next thing. Walk with the quiet trees. Can you believe how brave they are? How kind. Model your life after theirs. Blow kisses at yourself in the mirror, especially when you think you've messed up. Good advice. Forgive yourself for not meeting your unreasonable expectations. You are human, not God. You are human, not God. Don't be so arrogant. Praise fresh air, clean water, good dogs. Spend something from joy. Open a window, even if it's cold outside, even if it's cold outside. Sit, close your eyes, breathe. Allow the river of it all to pulse through your eyelashes. Ah, what a line. Close your eyes, breathe, allow the river of it all to pulse through eyelashes, fingertips, bare toes. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe until you feel your bigness, until the sun rises in your veins. Breathe until you stop needing anything to be different. Let me say that one again. Breathe, breathe until you stop needing anything to be different. Now, that is a radical kind of acceptance. And it's paradoxical, a little bit like the paradox that's underneath this episode about allowing the sorrow to come in, even helping others with their sorrow, and paradoxically having that open us up to joy, open us up to a resilient kind of joy. What we deny persists. That's the note I made. It's been my own life's experience. I don't know about you. Sometimes we have these little aphorisms that say, sometimes the best way around is through, that we need to work with, in this case, our sadness. Invite the joy. I said, what we deny persists, maybe especially sadness. That's my thought. And when we see others' sadness and help them carry that sadness, we open ourselves up to the kind of joy, as we were already saying, that is more resilient, more sustainable. It's one of those words that has jumped into our lexicon in recent times because of all those ecological predicaments that we find ourselves in. Remember, we have political, social, and of course, ecological, not just challenges, predicaments. Okay, the cure for it all. Let's keep cooking. Now, this poem has got a little, I think I'd call it, it's got a little humor to it, but it's also got some good punch. And it's, well, let me just read it. You decide. You decide. I think it's got some coyote energy. That coyote energy that comes out of the indigenous Native American tradition, the trickster. Okay, it's called Good Bones by Maggie Smith, another great poet. Life is short. Life is short. First two words of the poem. Life is short, though I keep this from my children. Life is short, and I've shortened mine in 1,000 delicious, ill advised ways. Can you relate? By the way, as I'm recording this, today is Thanksgiving Day in the United States. And if you're, by the time you hear this, it will be past, but I hope you had a good one, a good Thanksgiving Day, a good day of gratefulness, I call it sometimes. So she says, life is short, though I keep this for my children. Life is short, and I've shortened mine in 1,000 ill advised ways, 1,000 deliciously ill advised ways. I'll keep for my children. The world is at least 50% terrible, and that's a conservative estimate. Though I keep this for my children. For every bird, there is a stone thrown at a bird. For every loved child, a child broken, bagged, sunk in a lake. Life is short, and the world is at least half terrible. And for every kind stranger, there is one who will break you. Though I keep this from my children, I am trying to sell them the world. I am trying to sell them the world. Any decent realtor walking through a real shithole chirps on about good bones. This place could be beautiful, right? This place could be beautiful, right? You could make this place beautiful. Those last lines by Maggie Smith, Good Bones, the poem. She says, life is short, and the world is at least half terrible. And for every kind stranger, there is one who would break you. Though I keep this from my children, I am trying to sell them the world. Any decent realtor walking you through a real shithole chirps on about good bones. This place could be beautiful, right? You could make this place beautiful. Well, I thought to myself, I wanted to include this poem, but I thought to myself, we might get the feeling that this poem is actually making the opposite point of this episode, right? She's keeping all this from her children. That it might be against the thesis in this podcast, but I don't think she's really suggesting that. I think uh, that we certainly all have some kind of fall from innocence. And some people, when they suffer that fall, some of us, that sadness overwhelms us, maybe because we're trying to deny too much of it. Um, and or for whatever reason, we become cynical. We sort of shut our heart down, shut our mind down, and kind of get lost in a kind of frozen sadness. Um, but this fall from innocence can also be where we must decide how we are to deal with difficult things, because there are difficult things in this life. Have you noticed? And yes, whether we try to hide or deny, or hide and deny our sorrow, or engage people in a kind of ongoing potluck of sorrows where we invite theirs, and after acknowledging ours, we can have them help us shoulder our sorrows. And so I think in a kind of coyote way, in a kind of humor, almost humorous way, that the poet is making this kind of statement, not so much about keeping this from her kids, although, which, I mean, by the way, how long does it take any of us to understand these things? um, you know, how long does it take? And yeah, yeah, we get these things, these difficult things about the world very, very early in our lives. Seems to be what happens. Um, now, um, yeah, yeah, inviting each other into our potluck of sorrows. This place could be beautiful, right? You could make this place beautiful. Wonderful poem. Okay, so I want to um, move to a poem which is by Jack Gilbert. He was a local Bay Area poet, lived for many years or in his later years in Berkeley. What was so interesting about Jack Gilbert is he came onto the scene as a young man, was a rock star poet, and then he just got bored with that whole kind of attention that he was getting in the and all of the hoopla around it, and he just left. He went to I think like a Greek island and pretty much just dropped out completely. And it was years before he wrote more poetry. But I just always thought, anything. This guy is like the poster child for not being coin operated. He's the poster child for not being swayed by, the kind of allure of attention that is so alluring for us most of the time. So anyway, he wrote this poem. I love a lot of his work. Look him up, Jack Gilbert. You'll find his poems around, and you can buy his books. Yeah, do that. A brief for the defense. I think you'll know why I've included this when I say it. A brief for the defense. Sorrow everywhere, slaughter everywhere. If babies are not starving someplace, they are starving somewhere else with flies in their nostrils. But we enjoy our lives because that's what God wants. Those are some intense lines, aren't they? Sorrow everywhere, slaughter everywhere. If babies are not starving someplace, they are starving somewhere else with flies in their nostrils. But we enjoy our lives because that's what God wants. Otherwise, the mornings before summer dawn would not be so fine. The Bengal tiger would not be fashioned so miraculously well. The poor women at the fountain are laughing together between the suffering they have known and the awfulness in their future, smiling and laughing while somebody in the village is very sick. There is laughter every day in the terrible streets of Calcutta, and the women laugh in the cages of Bombay. If we deny our happiness, resist our satisfaction, we lessen the importance of their deprivation. We must risk delight. We must risk delight. We can do without pleasure, but not delight, not enjoyment. Enjoyment, not joy, not enjoyment, he says. We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of the world. To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil. If the locomotive of the Lord runs us down, we should give thanks that the end had magnitude. We must admit there will be music despite everything. We stand at the prow again of a small ship anchored late at night in the tiny port, looking over to the sleeping island. The waterfront is there, shuttered cafes and one naked light burning. To hear the faint sound of oars in the silence as a rowboat comes slowly out and then goes back is truly worth all the years of sorrow that are to come. Let's visit those last three lines one more time. To hear the faint sound of oars in the silence as a rowboat comes slowly out and then goes back is truly worth all the years of sorrow that are to come. Now, you would be forgiven at certain times in this poem to think that Jack Gilbert has just, given in to a kind of cynicism, you know. Um, but I don't think that's the case. I think what he is saying, the feeling that I get, is that we are invited again, not to be devastated, not to be shut down into a kind of silence, not to be permanently placed up in the stands and looking down at others on the field of action because we are so devastated by the difficulties in life. That if we are able to recognize those difficulties, recognize the sadness, recognize even the despair at times inside of ourselves and with others, and help others with that, that it gives us the opportunity for joy. And actually, in a paradoxical way, my own experience, I'd be curious as you think about this. My own experience is that paradoxically, if I can get centered, if I can experience delight, enjoyment, and joy, that when I come back to the game, when I come back, I'm encouraged to get down metaphorically on the field and play. And again, I'm saying play in a very broad sense, to be an actor, to be an agent in my own life, to have agency in my own life. I'm encouraged to do that if I can keep my heart open, even in the most difficult situations, even in light of my own sadness, particularly in light of my own sadness and in light of others' difficulties and sadness. And then, paradoxically, I may very well have a chance to be wise enough, to be courageous enough, to be brave enough to do something that actually might help in some of these situations. It actually might help. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention, I wanted to give a little shout out to something that I talked about in last episode. I said that all great poems are alike in three ways. The first is that they invite us in to have our own experience. They don't close down and beat us over the head with some kind of prescribed feeling that we must have or some idea that we must have. And but at the same time, we have to walk in and be open to that. The second thing, so they invite us in to have our own experience. The poem often feels like it speaks through us and not at us. So it's almost like the words come through us. That's the second of my three ways that all great poems are alike. And the third is it does something real and practical and palpable for us. And I think that these poems today, particularly this last one, it invites us in. And that place that it invites us in is not all that comfortable in a number of places in this poem. Sorrow everywhere, slaughter everywhere. And we are invited in to have our own experience. We are trusted as the reader that we're going to come in with a kind of attention, with a kind of awareness, so we can have our own experience. So anyway, look for a future episode where I'm going to zero in on those three things and talk about them in more depth. But I just wanted to bring that back up. Okay, our last poem for this episode on heartbreak, yours and mine, is a poem by William Stafford. And boy, you want to talk about a difficult situation. William Stafford, his son Brett, committed suicide. And this was late in Stafford's life, not that many years before he himself passed. He was about to turn 80 when he passed. And he wrote a poem called A Memorial, Son Brett. And again, this is the son who took his own life. So, a memorial, son Brett. In the way you went, you were important. In the way you went, you were important. I do not know what you found. In the pattern of my life, you stand where you stood always, in the center, a hero, a puzzle, a man. What you might have told me, I will never know. What you might have told me, I will never know. The lips went still, the body cold. I am afraid in the circling stars, in the dark, and even at noon in the light. When I run, what am I running from? You turned once to tell me something, but then you glimpsed a shadow on my face and maybe thought, why tell what hurts? You carried it, my boy, so brave, so far. Now we have all the days, and the sun goes by the same. There is a faint wandering trail I find sometimes off through the grass and sage. I stop and listen. Only summer again. Remember? The bees, the wind. A memorial, son Brett. In the way you went, you were important. I do not know what you found. In the pattern of my life, you stand where you stood always, always in the center, a hero, a puzzle, a man. What you might have told me, I will never know. The lips went still, the body cold. I am afraid in the circling stars, in the dark, and even at noon in the light. When I run, what am I running from? You turned once to tell me something, but then you glimpsed a shadow on my face and maybe thought, why tell what hurts? You carried it, my boy, so brave, so far. Now we have all the days, and the sun goes by the same. There is a faint wandering trail I find sometimes off through the grass and sage. I stop and listen. Only summer again. Remember? The bees, the wind. So many things that I appreciate about that poem. And when I was putting this episode together, I thought to myself, that really is so many points here. It's, I think, William Stafford really stepping into his own sadness and letting that sadness wash over him, and talking about the idea or the implication that maybe his son Brett did not share some of his own deep sadness. Now, it's a very complex thing, and depression and all sorts of things, I'm sure, involved. Um, and at the same time, there is a sense that if we are able to share our sadness, have someone else carry it, that or help us carry it, and we theirs, that there's a chance for healing and a chance for joy. So there's many questions I have, but this poem felt like it was one I wanted to include. Jack Gilbert, the poet that we just read, and I just spoke to you, said, "We must risk delight. We can do without pleasure, but not delight. We can do without pleasure, but not delight." And I think this territory of delight and joy, it's all the same thing. We can be incredibly sad and be also amazed and joyful and delighted at the natural world, at the smallest thing with someone we love that does a kindness for us. But if we're shut down by a sadness that we will not recognize, that we can't, it's not about blame, it's not about any of that, but and it's the idea that if we are shut down for whatever reason and we can't own our sadness, we can't acknowledge it, and we can't share it with another, and they can't share theirs, that there's a chance that we are not going to be able to step into delight, step into joy, and that we could actually be overwhelmed by sadness that we are not able to acknowledge. And again, this is not about being wrong in any way. It's about awareness. It's about allowing these poems to help us step into a territory where we can have potlucks, sorrow potlucks with our loved friends and loved ones, and all the above. Okay, so I wanted to end with a few other comments. Philosopher Theodore Adorno famously said after World War II, to write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric. And yet one Holocaust survivor did precisely that. The Romanian poet Solon, whose native language was German, wrote poems in a work camp. And Auschwitz, I'm not sure if he was there. I think I misspoke that. I don't think he was there, but he was in a work camp, and he sent those poems home to his beloved. So I understand, of course, the sentiment of to write a poem after World War II and the Holocaust could seem barbaric on one level, and yet Jack Gilbert said that might be the greatest pushback, the greatest resistance might be to allow ourselves to experience joy. And the little bit that I know about some of the Holocaust camps and events is that there was this underground resistance to having it take people's lives over. And there was still writing of music, performing of music, plays, and poetry. So I think that is incredibly courageous. It gives me that's what courage to be able to invite joy into our lives when there's that much pain and sorrow. And yet, paradoxically, that's the point we're saying. That's maybe when we need that joy and that delight and the stories and the art and the poetry more than ever. This poet that I was just mentioning, he is now considered, who wrote the poems in the camp, he is now considered one of the major innovative poets of the 20th century. Like others involved in creative resistance, he had to recreate his medium. In his case, he was repelled by his language, his native tongue of the Nazis, the German. Hence, he attempted to reinvent the German language, distancing it from the lyricism of others to encompass a new and terrible reality. His poem, and I'm not going to say this correct, this is in the German, Todesfuge, reflecting his life in a concentration camp, is considered a masterpiece. I was inspired when I read this. Lastly, and we're heading for the barn in our conversation today. And by the way, this is my intent. my intent is that these be conversations, not that I am speaking, talking at you or anything like that. It's to be a conversation. And I hope that's the way these come off, so that we can talk about poetry. We can talk about practical ways to use poetry in our lives, and, just rejoice in it um, as best we can. So my note says, what has broken or is breaking your heart? That's the question. What has broken or is right now breaking your heart? A death, a loss, a dream denied, a profound disappointment, seeing so much pain and struggle in the social, political, and ecological domains. Maybe that's what's causing it. I know many young people are so discouraged. They are so discouraged. And the sadness, I think, must be acknowledged. And we must be able to help each other share that. Of course, that's the theme we've been talking about. I said, giving our sorrow, finally, giving our sorrow a home, giving the sorrow of friends and loved ones the healing treatment of being seen and heard, of being seen and heard. Maybe that's the deep, profound lesson that we all have to learn. Okay. That's a wrap. That's a wrap. And again, I want to say, I think I've already said this, but joy may be the ultimate resistance to difficulties and pain and even despair. And in order to call it to us, in order to more effectively pickle ourselves, to use one of my corny metaphors, pickle ourselves for joy requires that we accept, that we acknowledge, that we step right into our sadness and allow others to step into our sadness, and we to do the same for them. Joy may be the ultimate resistance. Okay, that's it. That's a wrap. And as I always say, if you liked what you heard today, or if you were inspired or you learned something, pass it along to some others. Write a comment. Any of that stuff would be great. I enjoy doing these podcasts. I love having these conversations with each of you virtually through the screen. And as I always say, until next time and next poem, take good care of yourself.